The crowd was buzzing with energy, a mix of voices filling the air as people gathered around, eager to witness the exchange unfolding before them. Cameras were rolling, their red lights blinking like watchful eyes, capturing every moment for the world to see. The setting was no stranger to heated debates, but today there was an unmistakable air of anticipation. The atmosphere shifted the moment she arrived, carrying herself with a confidence that didn't demand attention, but naturally commanded it. She was no stranger to public scrutiny, nor was she unfamiliar with the tactics used to provoke a reaction. She had faced it all before. Sharp words designed to cut deep, loaded questions meant to corner her, and dismissive tones that sought to undermine her experience. Yet, none of it rattled her. Her expression remained poised, her body language relaxed yet firm. It wasn't arrogance, nor was it defensiveness. It was the quiet assurance of someone who had spent years standing in the face of opposition without faltering. She wasn't here to engage in petty back and forths or entertain shallow provocations. She was here to speak the truth, and she was prepared to do so with the same unshakable clarity that had defined her career. The conversation started as expected, laced with subtle jabs and leading remarks meant to put her on the defensive. It was an old strategy. Create an environment where one misstep could be exploited, twist words to fit a narrative, and paint the opposition as flustered or uninformed. She recognized the pattern immediately. It was the same routine she had encountered countless times before, always delivered with the same air of assumed superiority. She didn't interrupt, nor did she react to the attempts at provocation. Instead, she listened, allowing each word to settle in the air before responding. There was no urgency in her demeanor, no sign that she felt pressured to prove herself. That alone unsettled those expecting her to stumble. The tone of the conversation grew more pointed, each remark laced with the expectation that she would waver under scrutiny, but she didn't. She met every question with measured words, refusing to be drawn into a game she had no intention of playing. Her responses weren't rehearsed sound bites or evasive deflections. They were direct, thoughtful, and grounded in reality. There was a shift in the crowd as people began to take notice, not just of what was being said, but how it was being said. The usual tactics weren't working. The more the exchange continued, the clearer it became that she wasn't the one struggling to keep control of the narrative. Her calm, composed manner stood in stark contrast to the increasingly impatient attempts to rattle her. The questions became more aggressive, more loaded, as if pressing harder would somehow force her into a corner. Yet she remained unmoved. Instead of taking the bait, she turned the conversation back to the facts, refusing to be derailed by theatrics. She had no interest in playing into dramatics or engaging in personal attacks. That wasn't why she was here. She was here to discuss the issues that mattered, to challenge falsehoods with truth, and to hold firm in her convictions. And that was exactly what she did. The more she spoke, the more the dynamic of the conversation shifted. What had started as an attempt to diminish her credibility was now exposing something else entirely. The strength of her arguments was undeniable, her composure unshaken. It was clear that she wasn't the one unprepared for this exchange. The people watching were no longer just passive observers. They were engaged, listening closely to every word she said. There was no need for grandstanding or fiery rhetoric. Her words carried enough weight on their own. The silence that followed each of her responses was telling. It wasn't the silence of someone struggling to find an answer. It was the silence of realization. A moment of recognition that the narrative being pushed wasn't as airtight as it was intended to be. And just like that, the energy in the room had changed. She took a breath, steady and composed, before speaking. There was no hesitation in her voice, no sign of uncertainty. Each word was deliberate, carrying the weight of experience and the confidence of someone who had nothing to prove but everything to clarify. Her tone wasn't aggressive, nor did it carry even a hint of frustration. Instead, it was measured, firm yet calm, assertive without being confrontational. This was where she thrived, not in the chaos of interruptions or the spectacle of a heated argument, but in the clarity of facts and reason. She had been in these situations before. She had seen how words could be twisted, how narratives could be shaped with a few well-placed phrases. But she had also learned something invaluable. Composure was the most powerful tool at her disposal. She began by addressing the core of the issue, not allowing distractions or exaggerated claims to pull the conversation in an unproductive direction. There was no need to match the tone of those who tried to provoke her. Instead, she used precision, countering each statement with a well-structured response, dismantling inaccuracies with undeniable facts. The difference in approach was striking. Where others relied on volume and dramatics, she relied on clarity. Where others attempted to frame the discussion around emotion, she redirected it to logic. It was an approach that required discipline, one that didn't rely on quick comebacks or personal attacks, but instead on an unwavering commitment to truth. The crowd listened intently, sensing the shift in control. Every attempt to push her into a defensive stance had failed, not because she was avoiding the confrontation, but because she was meeting it head-on with an approach that was impossible to dismiss. There was nothing vague about her words. She wasn't sidestepping difficult points or retreating into safe, rehearsed phrases. She was answering directly, methodically, and with a level of confidence that left little room for misinterpretation. She anticipated the next challenge before it even arrived. It was a pattern she had seen countless times, a pivot to a different angle, a shift in focus to create the illusion that she had left something unanswered. But she wasn't fooled. The moment the conversation tried to take a detour, she steered it back, refusing to be led away from the truth. Her presence alone made an impact, but it was her ability to maintain control of the conversation that truly set her apart. Even as the questions grew sharper, even as the attempts to undermine her authority became more transparent, she never wavered. If anything, she became even more precise, more deliberate with her words. The frustration in the air was almost palpable. Those who had expected her to falter were now grasping for new ways to regain control, but it was already too late. She had turned the momentum of the conversation in her favor, not through aggression or arrogance, but through the sheer strength of her argument. She wasn't just responding, she was leading. Every sentence built upon the last, forming an undeniable chain of logic that left no room for misinterpretation. Her confidence wasn't performative, nor was it reliant on applause or validation from the crowd. It came from something deeper, the knowledge that she had done her homework, that she wasn't speaking from opinion alone, but from a foundation of truth that couldn't be shaken. People in the audience were starting to react. Some nodded. Some whispered to each other, recognizing that this wasn't going the way it had been intended. The shift was subtle but undeniable. It was no longer about who could speak the loudest or deliver the most cutting remark. It was about who had the strongest grasp of the facts. She didn't rush to fill the silences that followed her statements. She let them linger, allowing the weight of her words to settle. There was power in those pauses, in the realization that there was no immediate counter, no easy way to dismiss what had just been said. This wasn't about winning an argument in the traditional sense. It wasn't about personal pride or ego. It was about something far more significant: the truth. And she had made sure with every carefully chosen word that it would not be ignored. The atmosphere had shifted in a way that was impossible to ignore. It was subtle at first, just a slight pause, a brief hesitation in the air. But as seconds passed, it became clear that something far greater had happened, something no one had expected. The once confident energy that had filled the space only moments ago had drained away, leaving behind nothing but silence. It wasn't the kind of silence that came from disinterest or distraction. It wasn't the quiet murmur of a crowd waiting for the next moment to unfold. No, this was different. This was the kind of silence that came when people were forced to reevaluate everything they thought they knew. The kind that arrived when the weight of truth settled too heavily to be ignored. Eyes shifted, glances were exchanged, but no one spoke. The usual sounds, quick retorts, dismissive laughter, the subtle hum of conversation, had disappeared entirely. Even those who had been eager to speak before now hesitated, as if suddenly aware that the moment was no longer theirs to control. She stood firm, unshaken, allowing the silence to stretch as long as it needed to. There was no need to rush it, no need to fill the space with unnecessary words. The truth had already been spoken, and that truth had done something no amount of noise could undo. It had forced everyone to listen. It was clear that the initial plan had been to push her into a defensive position, to throw words at her so quickly that she wouldn't have time to respond effectively, but that strategy had failed. She had not only kept her composure, but had taken control of the entire conversation without ever raising her voice or stepping outside the bounds of reason. Instead of falling into the trap of emotional outbursts or rushed responses, she had chosen her words with precision, each one landing exactly where it needed to. There had been no hesitation, no uncertainty, just clarity. And that clarity had left those around her with nothing to grasp onto. A few in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, glancing around as if waiting for someone to break the silence. But no one did. The moment stretched on, the weight of what had just happened settling more deeply with every passing second. There was something undeniably powerful about the way she had handled the situation. It wasn't just about the words she had spoken, though they had been sharp and irrefutable. It was about the way she had delivered them, with an unwavering confidence that didn't rely on volume or theatrics, but on the strength of truth itself. Those who had been expecting a different outcome were now faced with the uncomfortable reality that they had underestimated her. They had assumed this would be just another exchange, another opportunity to take control of the narrative. But now, that illusion had crumbled. The energy in the room had shifted so completely that even those who had been on the sidelines could feel it. The usual patterns of conversation, the expected back and forth, had been disrupted. There was no easy way to move past what had just occurred. The silence itself had become the answer to everything that had been said. Somewhere in the crowd, a camera remained fixed on her, its lens capturing the stillness of the moment. This wasn't just about what had been said. It was about what couldn't be said in response. It was about the undeniable impact of truth when spoken with confidence and conviction. The seconds stretched on, the silence deepening, as if waiting for someone to finally acknowledge what had happened. But there was nothing to be said. Nothing that wouldn't seem hollow in the face of what had just unfolded. And so, the silence remained. The moment lingered, its weight undeniable. The silence that had fallen wasn't the kind that came when a conversation naturally lulled. It was something far heavier. It carried an unspoken realization, an admission that, despite every effort to steer the situation in a different direction, control had been lost. Expressions shifted across the crowd. Some remained still, their gazes locked onto her, while others exchanged uncertain glances, searching for some indication of what to do next. It was clear that what had just happened was not the expected outcome. What had started as an attempt to dismiss, undermine, or redirect had instead resulted in something entirely different. There was a moment, just a brief one, where it seemed as though someone might try to recover, to reassert the old confidence that had filled the air only moments before. But that moment passed, swallowed by the understanding that no words would change what had just happened. She didn't gloat. There was no triumphant smirk, no self-satisfied remark to emphasize her victory. She didn't need one. The truth had already done the work, standing unchallenged in the wake of the silence that followed. And she knew something that others in the room were only just beginning to realize. This wasn't about winning an argument. This wasn't about making someone feel small or forcing a concession. This was about something far greater. It was about the power of standing firm in the face of opposition. It was about refusing to be rattled, no matter how strong the attempts to provoke or mislead. It was about showing that integrity mattered more than theatrics, that confidence rooted in truth would always outlast empty rhetoric. She had seen it happen before. She knew how these exchanges were supposed to go. The raised voices, the interruptions, the tactics designed to throw her off balance. But none of those had worked. Not this time. because no matter how many times the strategy had been used before, it had no effect against someone who refused to engage in the game being played. And that was what had truly shifted the dynamic. It wasn't just the facts she had presented or the way she had dismantled every weak argument thrown her way. It was the way she had done it, with calm certainty, with unshakable conviction. She had never once allowed the conversation to be dictated by emotion or theatrics. She had remained steady, guiding the discussion back to reality every single time it threatened to veer into distortion. The realization of that fact settled in across the room. Even those who had entered the space convinced of a certain narrative now found themselves hesitating, their certainty shaken. It wasn't because she had forced them to agree, nor because she had demanded they change their minds. It was because, whether they admitted it or not, they had seen something undeniable, truth, delivered without apology, and that had an effect that no amount of posturing or clever phrasing could undo. There was something powerful about watching someone stand in the face of opposition without flinching. She had done more than just respond. She had demonstrated something far greater. She had shown what it looked like to be unmovable, to hold firm to principles in the face of resistance. And in doing so, she had left an impression that no one in that room would forget. The silence had lasted long enough that even those watching from the sidelines began to shift uncomfortably. It was rare for moments like this to stretch so long, for there to be no immediate pivot, no quick attempt to regain lost footing. But that was the reality now. This wasn't just a brief stumble in the conversation, it was something much deeper. She had walked into this moment fully aware of what would happen. She had known the attempts that would be made, the way words would be twisted, the efforts that would be put into making her appear uncertain or defensive. And yet, she had walked in anyway, unafraid, unbothered by the prospect of being challenged. And now, after everything, she stood exactly as she had before. Steady, unshaken. Testament to the simple but profound reality that truth, when spoken without fear, needed no embellishment. It stood on its own. The moment had settled, its weight undeniable. The silence that lingered wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the presence of realization. No rebuttal had come, no last-minute attempt to steer the conversation back in the other direction. The truth had been spoken, and it remained immovable and absolute. She didn't have to press further. She had already done what needed to be done. This wasn't about forcing acknowledgement or demanding an admission of defeat. It was about something far greater. It was about showing that no amount of manipulation, no carefully crafted attempt to distort reality, could stand against the power of truth. The faces in the crowd reflected a range of emotions, some thoughtful, some unsettled, and others struggling to mask their surprise. This wasn't how they had expected things to unfold. And yet, here they were, sitting in the undeniable aftermath of a moment that would not be easily forgotten. She took a step back, not in retreat, but in quiet confidence. There was no need for celebration, no need for further words. What had been said was enough. Those who truly listened had heard, and those who refused to listen, well, that was no longer her concern. She knew how this worked. Some would try to move on quickly, acting as though nothing had happened. Others would attempt to twist the narrative later, hoping that a different framing might change the impact of what had just unfolded. But the truth had been spoken clearly, and those who had witnessed it would carry that moment with them, no matter how much others tried to rewrite it. It wasn't about personal victory. It wasn't about ego. It was about standing firm when it mattered most. It was about showing that no matter how loud deception tried to be, it would never have the power to silence reality. She turned, ready to leave, not because she was running from the moment, but because she had already won, not through insults, not through arrogance, but through an unshakable commitment to truth. And as she walked away,